Good evening. Hello, just a moment as we wait for anyone else to join us. Just a little bit of a gap, but I hope you had a good week. Hope you had a good day today. I don't know how you spend your Sundays. If you've spent them in fellowship of some kind, then I hope you had the best time. But if you've, whatever you've been up to, I hope that this Lord's Day, the Bible talks about the Sabbath day being God's gift to us. So I hope that today has felt like a gift, something beautiful. It's the Lord's Day like every other day. It belongs to Him and He's given them for us. If we're still breathing, it's a day to rejoice. So I hope you had a good day and a good Sunday. Tonight, in some ways, is a little different. It's a little, I suppose, a little less disconnected from what's going on in the world around us than some of these talks are. Now, often we might pick up on a theme or something that's happening in the world, but very much we're thinking about the experience that we have within the church. I want to start tonight by thinking about the events that took place 20 years ago yesterday. There is no doubt that every human emotion, every possible experience of grief and horror and distress and loss was experienced as 2,977 innocent people had their lives taken in the most brutal and unexpected of circumstances. However you have chosen to remember that event or not to remember that event, the reality is that at the heart of the story of 9/11 and the attacks in the United States is a story of individuals, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, everything culminating in one awful event. And you might have opinions about the things that happened in the aftermath and about the actions of the United States and our allies in the 20 years since. And I said in the trailer for this, I absolutely don't intend to be political tonight. You see, death is the enemy. Death is the enemy. There is no human that I'm at war with. There is no flesh and blood fight to be had. The Bible makes that clear. We don't war against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. It goes on and tells us that we have the victory in Christ, that actually it's not really an even-handed fight. But even so, we need to know that the only enemy is death itself. And so when any life is lost, it's a tragedy. But even more so, when that life is a life that did not choose the path. It's a life that had circumstances placed upon it. It is a life cut short. And so here we are 20 years later. And I don't know how you remember that day. I remember arriving in the office. I used to work sort of from late morning, and I arrived in the office and we had people on the ground. We had offices in World Trade Center. I was in Bristol, and we had a lot of staff working that time on a project who'd come from our Indian offices. And one of the first things that happened was that the police contacted us and said, we already have a credible threat against people that appear to be of Asian or potentially Muslim backgrounds. And so, unlike the team I was a part of, we weren't glued to the screens watching the horror of the events unfold in some bizarre sort of media-driven frenzy of revulsion and almost addiction to the horror of it. We were busily trying to protect the people that we worked with. But for each of us, we'll have our own memories. And for some, the memories will be of a day in which loved ones never came home. Fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, children who never returned. A day like any other day. In so many ways, when the dust had settled and the twisted remains had been memorialized. But for those people, a day that is inescapable, unavoidable, and forever defining their lives. And so I don't know how you remember it. I don't know how you choose to acknowledge it. If you choose to acknowledge it, there's no reason why you should. But each year I make a point of listing in my own personal social media, not the church setting. Obviously, you'd have seen that. But in my own personal social media, I make a point of posting a list of 346 names. What makes those names stand out for me amongst the 2,977 other innocents who died is that those 346 put themselves in harm's way. And not just that they are those who put themselves in harm's way, because there are others. That is not the whole cohort of firefighters and EMTs and police officers and other emergency services personnel who put themselves in harm's way. But those 346 are those who were retired or away or off duty, or for whatever reason were not in a position where they were expected to take the responsibility for fighting the fires and trying to get people out. These were people who could have said, my years of risk are completed, or my shift is over. People that were not even called upon. These are people who, having seen what was happening on the news, rolled up their sleeves and said, I am not standing by while someone else suffers. And so there are many heroes on that day, many people who did extraordinary things. I cannot imagine the experience of a firefighter climbing the stairwells against the crowd of people who are escaping. And I have no judgment at all for those who just chose to escape. But for those 346, it was not their duty, it was not their role, it was not their job. Some of them actually had to resign their positions in order to be able to go back in, because they were barred because of their seniority within the fire service or the police service from going into a scene like that, because they were expected to remain outside. And when they could see what was happening to the towers, they made a decision: I won't send someone else and not go myself. Every year I post those 346 names. Because amongst the horror of it, amongst the brutality of it, we might say that they were the very finest of us. In a world where the ugly, the brutal, the horrific, the deadly so often takes center stage, it is an act of defiance to think of what is lovely and wholesome and beautiful, even if with it comes great, great sorrow. And that's not all I want to talk about tonight. Because whilst I want to acknowledge those 346 lives laid down, whilst I want to say that I have undying respect and admiration for people who will do that ultimate act of personal sacrifice. Also, around this time every year, I see people who try to make a comparison between human heroes. And surely that 346 is the very finest example of human heroism. And they try to make a comparison between their sacrifice and that sacrifice which Jesus makes for lost and broken humanity. I want to be really clear that what I'm about to say is not intended to diminish their actions. Far from it. I remember them every year, and you can go and check if you really want to. You can check my social media every year. I repeat that list of names because they need to be remembered. And so this is not to dishonor them, but rather in the light of how extraordinary their actions were. This is to understand how great salvation really is. You see, this is what the Bible says about our incomparable God. Isaiah writes in Isaiah 46, sat there right between the early chapters of Isaiah in which he prophesies the need for Messiah and those later chapters in which he declares the nature and the character of the suffering servant. Isaiah 46 relays to us these statements by the God that we believe in. To whom will you liken me and make me equal? To whom would you compare me that we should be alike? For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. That's verse 5 and verse 9. I recommend you read the whole of Isaiah 46. It's extraordinary, but I'm going to read those two verses again. To whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that we should be alike? For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. You know, we might often think about that in terms of his creative power, of his majesty, of his purity and his holiness. We might think of it in his incomparable strength and wisdom. But it is also true in his sacrifice. It's also true in his victory. It is also true at his cross. When he offers forgiveness, he is God and there is none like him. There is no one to compare him to. There is no one that could be described in the same terms as him. For all the very finest, the very greatest of human heroes, not one is worthy to be compared to King Jesus. Their sacrifices are not of the same scale and they are not of the same nature. The Bible doesn't say that he died for those that he loved because they were lovely, or because they were good, trustworthy friends, or because they had somehow earned it. No, it says that while we were still sinners, it literally means while we were still a mess, while we were still substandard, while we were still incapable of living by any standards, even those we set ourselves, while we were blind and broken and foolish, he died for us. He didn't die for the lovely or the beautiful. He didn't die to rescue us from something that we did not deserve. You see, those 2,977 innocent lives, those who were in the towers, those who were on those hijacked planes, they were simply not deserving of what was about to happen to them. And so those who ran into the towers to rescue people that were facing a catastrophe and a tormented destruction that they had not brought upon themselves. Jesus doesn't go to the cross for those who are facing what they don't deserve. He goes to the cross for those who are facing what they absolutely deserve. And I don't need to talk about you. I'll talk about me. I deserved the judgment of God. The cross that he bore was a cross that was rightfully mine. And he loved me. And he loved you. And so he did not come for the one who was undeserving. He did not come to rescue us from something that was unjust, but rather he came to suffer the justice that we deserved. Not us only, but for everyone who's ever lived. You see, I'm always very careful when I speak about the events of 9/11 to distinguish between the innocent deaths and those who died because they had chosen a path of brutal murder. And so I speak of 2,977 lives lost. But Jesus comes to his enemies. Jesus comes for those who hate him, despise him. Jesus comes for those who have chosen death over life, who've chosen something destructive and worthy of judgment. Jesus comes for the thief on the cross and for Barabbas, who's released, though he's a known criminal when Jesus is condemned by the crowd. Jesus comes for the least and the worst, for the furthest and the most desperate. He comes for those that society fears because they are power hungry, and for those that society despises because they have no power. He came for me. He came for you. And so tonight, as I think of the extraordinary human acts of heroism that took place on that fateful day, I don't then begin to consider that they are somehow an indicator, or somehow that they speak of the same kind of love or devotion or commitment that my King Jesus showed at his cross. And I say, God, you know, there is no one to whom I could liken you, and no one to whom I could make you equal. There's no one to compare to you, and no one who I would even begin to consider would be your equal. For you are God, and there is no one like you. You are God, and there is no one else. No one else at all. It's an old hymn that says, how great a salvation. How great a salvation, you saints of the Lord. How great a salvation. You know, the reality of what Jesus does goes so much further than any human sacrifice, because he does not just respond to the crisis in which we find ourselves. He doesn't just rescue us from an undeserved fate. No. He takes the punishment we deserve, but more even than that, he planned before he formed us. I often speak about this in the joyful terms of the infinite creativity of God, that the God who formed all things, and this isn't about the process he used, it's about the intention. The God who formed all things could have formed an infinite number of universes any way he wanted to, but the Bible says this is the one that he formed. He could have had anything that he chose. He is God after all. He can do whatever he pleases. But he chose a creation with you in it and with me in it. Not only that, he chose a creation with us in it, a creation in which we would have freedom, a creation in which we would be born at precisely the right time, that we would have the opportunity to live the abundant life that he could provide for us. And he chose it knowing with an absolute certainty that the price of it, the cost of it would be the cross. See, that's the other great difference between King Jesus and every human hero. On that morning, 20 years ago yesterday, it was those 346 heroes got up. They weren't getting up as heroes. I mean, they had all the character, they had all the attributes, because you don't respond out of character when you're under that sort of duress. Can't behave one way all your life and then hope you're going to suddenly do something so extraordinary when the moment arises. But they woke up that morning, and it was a day like any other day. They hadn't planned it. If you'd given them the choice and said, well, you can save these people, but it's going to cost you your life, or you can take another path where there are no bombers and there are no planes hitting the buildings, and where you don't have to run the wrong way up the stairs to rescue those you might. They would have chosen a life without that sacrifice. They would have said, absolutely, we don't want there to be that awful position or situation in which we find ourselves having to make that choice to rescue some. But no one had God's arm up his back. No one had any ability. He is God, and he does as what he pleases. And so Jesus doesn't go to the cross as a victim. He doesn't go to the cross as one who has no authority or power. He doesn't go to the cross as one who is being surprised by what is happening. He goes to the cross as one who planned, one who saw and who knew and who chose. who loved you enough, who loves me enough, in fact, who loved the whole of humanity enough that seeing that their need would require such sacrifice, he still chose us, loved us. There's never been anyone born, nor will there ever be anyone born for whom that choice does not hold good. You know, one of the things I find deeply, deeply moving, in some ways perhaps more distressing than anything else, is the way in which so many of the people involved in that day were unheard of, unknown, and yet now they are memorialized all over the world. They are remembered. And it just goes to show the futility of so many memorials. How would you like to be remembered? I'd prefer it if I was there. How would you like us to keep your name in people's memory? I'd prefer to be present. I'm sure there's not one of them who would not swap all of the affection, all of the almost celebrity that they've received posthumously for one more day, one more hour with the people that they love. And so here we are. Here we are. What would we do? What would we do if we understood how great the rescue that Jesus accomplished for us really was? What would we do if we could see the great gulf between even the finest of humanity and the love of Jesus Christ? Tonight I choose Jesus, as I have done many times before, as I do every time I'm faced with overwhelming odds or faced with a choice to make. I choose Jesus, because nobody loves like him. Nobody sacrifices like he did. Nobody has ever given what he gave or accomplished what he accomplished. Here's the amazing thing about it. Tonight, as you and I choose Jesus, we're able to do it because all those thousands of years ago, Jesus chose us. Knowing what it would cost him, he chose us. That's our thoughts for tonight. God bless you. Have a great week. You know, if there's one thing that can transform your whole outlook on the world, is if when you connect with people, when you encounter folks, whatever your personal reaction is, you remember Jesus chose sacrifice for the sake of the person that you're interacting with. No one excluded, no one left out, no one cut off. Knowing everything that it would cost him, there's no one he didn't choose to save. God bless. We'll see you next week.